Hello and welcome to Cognitations, a podcast in which we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it applies to our everyday lives. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. It encompasses domains such as cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and more. Let's jump into today's episode. Hello and welcome to Cogitations, episode 9. With today's hosts, as usual, I'm Jay.
And I'm Tanai.
After 8 episodes where we discussed intricacies of different areas of cognitive science, reasoning, the evolution of cultures, our relationship to our bodies, public policy, how children can learn language, schizophrenia, the relationship between economics and neuroscience, and so on, one can wonder, what even is cognitive science? How can a field of scientific investigation cover such a wide array of diverse phenomena across different levels of explanation? Why even use the term cognitive science? Don't neuroscience and psychology cover it all already? Well, there are answers to this question. In today's episode, in order to gain some clarity and a step back, we turn towards the history and foundations of cognitive science with today's guest.
He's Pierre Jacob. He is a CNRS emeritus director of research. He is one of the founding members of the European Society for Analytic Philosophy, and from 2001 to 2009 was the first director of the Institut Jean Nicod. Pierre has had an outstanding career as a philosopher of mind and cognitive science. He's worked on the nature of representations and explanations in psychology, on visual perception, and most recently on our ability to understand the minds of others and its developmental roots. He's the author of multiple academic books, including, but not limited to, What Minds Can Do, Intentionality in a Non-Intentional World in 1997, and Ways of Seeing, the Scope and Limits of Visual Cognition in 2003 with renowned neuroscientist Marc Jeannerod, if I pronounced that name correctly. So welcome, Pierre.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
So just to get us started, for our listeners, could you describe your academic journey till now and how you got interested into cognitive science?
Okay. So first thing, I'm French. And so I studied philosophy in France in the late 60s, early 70s of the 20th century, which tells you that I'm, not that young anymore, as you might have suspected. And then, so when I was a philosophy student in France, I studied mostly the history of philosophy. And the dominant paradigm for practicing philosophy outside the history proper was, let's say, continental philosophy, okay? But then I became a student in the States, and I was a student at Harvard for 5 years, and I was in between the history of science department there and the philosophy department, but I spent most of my time in the philosophy department, and I was a student of Hilary Putnam, and I wrote a PhD thesis under his sponsorship, which was a kind of history of recent philosophy of science with heavy emphasis on the rise and fall of logical positivism or logical empiricism.
And what is logical positivism?
Logical positivism and logical empiricism were doctrines espoused by philosophers in the analytic tradition, that is the tradition which basically was generated in Germany and England in the very late 19th, early 20th century by figures such as Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, G.E. Moore. Wittgenstein was one of the major figures in the early 20th century. So logical positivists and logical empiricists were philosophers who in the 1920s, 1930s wanted to use the tools of mathematical logic that had been created by basically Frege and Russell to clarify issues such as, and in particular to dissolve what they thought of as pseudo-problems as opposed to genuine problems by using logic, and particularly by distinguishing what belongs to science, to metaphysics, and they were concerned with the program of dissolving nonsense, of pseudo-problems that are addressed by what they thought was traditional philosophy. I was interested in logical positivism as a major stage in philosophy of science in the analytic tradition, in general philosophy of science in the analytic tradition. And then I went back to France, and then I became a CNRS researcher, and I discovered the field of cognitive science as a way of trying to investigate scientific questions which were raised by which were traditional questions in either in the humanities or in the social sciences. For about the 15 years or so, my own work was devoted to an issue that was very lively in the philosophy of mind of the 1980s and 1990s, which was to try and find a naturalistic basis for intentionality. Yes, and intentionality is a technical word in philosophy, which doesn't really mean what it means for common sense. I mean that intentionality is a word that was used first by the philosopher Brentano in the late 19th century, basically to mean representation, right? So to have intentionality is to be able to represent things other than the representing device, okay? And Brentano thought that intentionality, the power to represent objects, states of affairs and properties in the world, is a criterion of mental states and mental events and features.
Was there a substantive bridge between your interest in the history of science and the philosophy of science and this foundational issue to the philosophy of mind, cognitive science?
Yes. So some philosophers, and I'll mention, let's say, the logician Quine, okay, thought that intentionality, the power to represent things, the power also to attribute representational states to other people, is part of a common sense or folk psychological way of understanding people, but it cannot belong to science because for a number of reasons. So he presented a kind of a dilemma such that either you take intentionality seriously as Brentano did, but you're bound to be an ontological dualist, to accept a basic metaphysical distinction the way Cartesian dualism did. So he thought that Brentano offered a new version of ontological dualism based on intentionality. And in the 1990s, a number of philosophers who subscribed to materialism or physicalism challenged Quine's own challenge to intentionality. Quine's challenge to intentionality was that you cannot reconcile belief that intentionality is a real feature of the world, an important feature of the world that could be part of a scientific understanding of minds, and the fact and subscribing to ontological physicalism, ontological materialism, which is inconsistent with ontological dualism, right? So that was Quine's view. I mean, that either you believe that intentionality is real, but then you have to give up materialism or physicalism and espouse ontological dualism, or you subscribe to physicalism, a monist ontological view of the world, but then you have to give up the view that intentionality is a significant feature of the real world. It's just, a kind of an illusion that we humans have about how people act, behave, but it doesn't reflect a genuine, real feature of the world. But some philosophers challenged Quine's challenge, and they tried to naturalize intentionality, to find a physical, non-intentional basis for intentionality, to try to find, for example, in the brain of human agents, a physical sufficient basis for the fact that people, humans, and maybe other animals too, can represent their environment. And so my work in the late 1990s was devoted to trying to discuss the views of various of the philosophers who wanted to reconcile the realism about intentionality and materialism or physicalism, the denial of ontological dualism. The main philosophers who had been really actively thinking about this were people like Jerry Fodor, Fred Retzky, Ruth Millikan, and their view, the idea for bridging the gap between intentionality and the rest of the physical world was either informational semantics, or an evolutionary approach which they call teleosemantics, which is to try to find a basis in evolution by natural selection. So much of my work in the 1990s, that's the book that you mentioned earlier, What Minds Can Do, published in 1997, is devoted to this question of how can we try and reconcile intentionality with a non-intentional world and find a bridge between intentionality and the rest of the world. And then I was a member of a group of philosophers working in France. What was distinctive about us, I think, in the 1990s, late 20th century, the group was CREA, that was just before the creation of Institut Jean Nicod, was the interdisciplinary feature of the kind of work we were doing, either in the philosophy of language or the philosophy of mind. We were interested in looking at the way cognitive science, and maybe you can ask me more about how I want to define cognitive science, but how cognitive scientists can shed light on some of the kind of philosophical questions or even metaphysical questions that we were interested in through philosophy of language and through philosophy of mind, the link between, say, mind and world in a way. So cognitive science was the way we thought, one of the tools that could be useful for philosophers if they wanted to clarify some of these philosophical questions. And then I was part of a group that created the Lyon Institute of Cognitive Science, and that gave me an opportunity to really cooperate with cognitive neuroscientists, particularly Marc Jeannerod, who you mentioned, with whom I wrote a book published in 2003 called Ways of Seeing, the Scope of Visual Cognition, which is a book which was devoted to trying to discuss evidence in favor of a two-systems model of human vision, where two-systems model of human vision means that it was found that there is a bifurcation from the primary human areas in the cortex of primates, not just human, but all primates, including human beings, and that there is a separation between the so-called ventral pathway, which projects the occipital visual areas onto the inferotemporal cortex, and the dorsal pathway, which connects the visual information processing area with the motor system. And so the question was how to interpret this bifurcation, this anatomical bifurcation between the ventral pathway and the dorsal pathway in the visual system, the visual cortex of primates. There are also versions in non-primates, but so there's very interesting work in psychophysics and in neuropsychology and brain lesion patients. And we tried, Jeannerod, who was a neuroscientist, and myself, to analyze much of the evidence for, to provide a kind of coherent interpretation of the role that this anatomical bifurcation plays from a functional point of view. So two cognitive neuroscientists had proposed the idea that the ventral pathway is vision for perception and the dorsal pathway is vision for action. And so we tried to kind of make some improvement on that view.
So in a sense, your career started from the history of science, looking at science from the outside, and
That's right.
as it progressed, you got closer and closer to actually doing the science, or you really engaging with it
Yes.
substantially.
I tried,
Yeah.
absolutely, yes. My last step in the past 10 to 15 years, and you mentioned it, and it's important, is that I moved to the study of social cognition. I mean, through cognitive science. I mean, and the transition from studying vision with Marc Jeannerod to social cognition was through investigating the significance of the discovery of mirror neurons in the brains of macaque monkeys, and then evidence about what role mirror neuron activity might play in the brains of humans, particularly what role it might play in social cognition, where the people who had discovered mirror neurons said that it plays a role in reading minds, in mind reading, in enabling the observer of an agent who performs a goal-directed action to attribute an intention, to understand the mind of the agent by covertly replicating the agent's action. But I thought that the mind-reading interpretation of the discovery of mirror neurons in macaque monkeys was disputable or debatable. And so I wrote on this, and from this I became really interested in mental state attribution in humans, and in particular in the developmental investigation of mental state attribution in human children. And then I discovered there is a big puzzle in the in the developmental psychological investigation of mental state attribution, through particularly false belief attribution, and maybe we don't have time for explaining why false belief attribution became such a central focus of scientific interest in developmental psychology, but it became central. And
Maybe we can circle back around to it once we've gone through some...
Right, so then I was interested in, the puzzle was that verbal tasks, when you ask, you tell a story about an agent who has a false belief, and you ask young children to predict where an agent with a false belief will look for an object about whose location the agent has a false belief. But the child or the participant in the study knows, right, the location. You find that 3-year-old fail massively. I mean, very robust. Not until about children reach the age of 4.5 or 5 are children capable of succeeding on this false belief task, verbal false belief task. But later evidence, that was, the verbal tests were designed first around in the mid-1980s, but then in 2005, psychologists managed to use non-verbal tests, which had been used in developmental psychology for other purposes than study of mental state attribution, in naive physics, or in numerical cognition, and so on. And these non-verbal tests, using, for example, violation of expectation, looking behavior, anticipation, or brain signals in the brains of very young infants, of pre-verbal infants, 6 months age, for example, provided evidence that, in fact, they are attributing false beliefs. So there was a puzzle how to reconcile these discrepant findings based on verbal tasks and based on non-verbal tasks. And so that's what I've been thinking about for the past 5-10 years. Yeah.
So to sort of...
Sorry, it's too long.
No, not a problem at all.
Okay.
But yeah, so far
we can go back to cognitive.
There have been some very philosophical loaded terms that have been thrown, like representations.
Yes.
And given that we presume that most of our listeners do not have a rich understanding of the underpinnings and emergence of cognitive science, I think this might be the moment to take a step back and start from its history.
Okay, excellent. We have to say something about what is characteristic of the birth or the emergence of cognitive science as a discipline. Now, let me say that basically it emerged, I think, historically in the 1950s, early 1950s. And as you said, a significant sign of the emergence of cognitive science has been the rejection of behaviorism as a way of studying behavior. I mean, human or non-human behaviors, because behaviorism was a very restricted kind of methodology in psychology to try and understand behavior by restricting the acceptable vocabulary of description and explanation of behavior to perceptual inputs and behavioral outputs, with nothing in between the perceptual input and the behavioral output, a black box not to be filled with mental representation. So cognitive science emerged when it was recognized that you cannot offer promising predictions, promising explanations of human and non-human behavior unless you introduce mental representations as intermediaries between perceptual inputs and behavioral outputs. And so there's a term expression called the cognitive revolution, which involved a number of disciplines, not just one discipline, not just psychology, even though psychology is, I think, the central one that kind of solidifies everything. So there were a number of disciplines, particularly including linguistics, artificial intelligence, and that is the study of computer programs and what computer programs can simulate and help understand about the performance of human behavior through computer simulation, but also neuroscience, of course. And I think the question of defining the enterprise that emerged in the 1950s, and it's a very interesting question. I mean, not just historically, but I think conceptually, it's a challenging question. I think that there are two ways to go. And I think the singular word, I mean, when the English say, what's cognitive science? You asked me, what's cognitive science? You didn't ask me, what are the cognitive sciences? Or how to, define the cognitive sciences, but you asked me what. Well, I think it's interesting because I think, in a way, a philosopher today would say that there is a sense in which the cognitive science, the project of cognitive science, as it emerged in the 1950s and has been persisting throughout many different scientific developments, and in spite of the many differences, especially in the neurosciences, there's something, if you want to, there's a sense in which it makes sense to seek for a common project, which is the project of cognitive science. Whether you're a psychologist, you're a linguist, you're a neuroscientist, there's something which makes sense. It's not absurd. It's not a nonsensical, metaphysical wish. I think it's whether we can make sense of what enables human to construct their representation of the world. I mean, the question whether we can have a science of the way we do science, whether we can have a scientific understanding of what enables humans to have scientific knowledge, so a scientific understanding of scientific understanding.
But that would be a special case of representing the world,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
So what's fundamental here is
explaining
representation.
Is explaining representation.
And so saying that that there's something that unifies the cognitive sciences in such a way that we can call it cognitive science.
Right.
Is to maybe presuppose that there is a common framework or common objective explanation.
Yes, right.
That's what you need in order to unify
right.
a set of sciences.
Absolutely.
And when you started answering the question, you said, behaviorism rejected mental representations, and then from the cognitive revolution onwards, we thought, we need to postulate that they're mental representations.
Yes.
But so...
Yes.
At base, we could reformulate it in the following way. Behaviorists reject postulating things inside the mind.
Exactly.
And then from the cognitive revolution, we postulated things inside the mind.
Yes.
And so I guess the question is, why do these things have to be representations?
Excellent question. Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. And of course, there is no straightforward scientific answer to this question. That requires a kind of collaboration between the scientists who are trying to really understand behavior by positing these internal unobservable things in the mind, not knowing exactly what they're like, right? And philosophers who are really interested, let's say, since Brentano, have been interested in what Brentano was calling intentionality. So maybe there is an interesting dialogue. And I think one of the most fruitful way to start thinking about this has been what the philosopher Jerry Fodor okay, has proposed as a kind of as a model of how cognitive science should proceed. I mean, both as a scientific issue and a philosophical issue. Okay, and Fodor was very close. He's dead now. He died in a few years ago.
2017, I think.
Yes, exactly.
19.
Yeah. I think 2017 exactly. And yes, exactly. He was born in 1935, and he was a collaborator and friend, in particular, of Noam Chomsky. Very much influenced by Chomsky's work in generative linguistics, when Chomsky created generative linguistic transformational grammar and so on. Fodor was a philosopher very, very closely influenced by the work of Chomsky in linguistics. So what Fodor proposed was what he himself called the computational representational picture or theory of the mind. Computational representational theory of the mind. The general idea was that, work in logic and computing, from the work of the great logicians of the 1920s, 1930s, people like Gödel, Alan Turing, who is the logician who gave rise to really the computer and the Turing machine. The idea of a Turing machine was due to Turing, and that played a tremendous role at the birth of the cognitive sciences in the mind of Chomsky and Fodor. And the way Fodor proposed it was, we should think of the kind of mental processes that is going to be the topic for cognitive science as a topic for science and philosophy jointly, is to think that mental processes are computational processes, that the right model for thinking about mental processes is the kind of processes that goes on in a computer, okay? And he added that computational processes must take representations as input and representations as output, right? So what a computational process is something that takes a representation, modifies the representation according to a certain kind of algorithm, and spits another new representation, right? And he proposed furthermore that, we think in a language of thought in which there are primitive symbols which can be assembled through syntactic rules into bigger, larger symbols, and the meanings of the large symbols depend systematically on the meanings of the constituents and the rules of syntactic combination. And that's the way we should think about how to do the cognitive science. I mean, we should think of perception on this. We should think of reasoning, of memory on this general model, the computational representational theory of mind.
So this got abstract very quickly, even for me. And so I was wondering if it would be helpful if we could talk about an example, a very concrete example of what Fodor would characterize as a computational process, and what a representation might be for that computational process and what an output might be. I think that would really drive the point home, both for me and our listeners. Do you have such an example in mind that would sort of conform broadly with what Fodor proposed?
Okay. So what kind of... so if you think of, say, reasoning, okay, so... think of things, that logicians or psychologists of reasoning say that, some inferences are valid forms of inference and others are not, right? So, for example, from the proposition, if P then Q, as a premise, and the further premise that P, you can infer the truth of Q. Now, if P then Q is true and P is true, then Q is true.
So if my neighbor is walking a dog, then it's sunny outside. Right. My neighbor is walking a dog, and from those two sentences, I can infer
you can
it's sunny
detach.
outside.
It's exactly. So that is easy to implement as a way that you follow intuitively the force of this rule of inference, right? I mean, So take another example, which is slightly less intuitive, but which is also a valid way of accepting a conclusion from premises, which is called the first one was called modus ponens.
Right.
The one I'm going to discuss now is called modus tollens, right? So take the same premise, if P then Q,
Right.
from the negation of the consequent Q, you can validly infer the negation of the antecedent. You can P is not P. So if P then Q and not Q, then not P, and you can give another.
Yeah, so just the same example.
Yes.
So start with the same first premise.
Right, exactly.
If my neighbor is walking her dog, then it's sunny outside.
It's not sunny outside.
You negate
It's
that,
sunny outside.
that it's sunny outside.
And you can
therefore,
conclude exactly the
my
negation
neighbor
of the
is walking the
antecedent.
dog.
Exactly. So these which are rules of inference that logicians have come from and which are taken to be valid rules of inference for logic, these principles of reasoning are easy to implement in the computational representational approach recommended by Fodor. I mean, you can have, if you have symbols in the mind, in the language of thought, which are as P and Q, and if you have symbols for conditional, negation, or disjunctional, take the disjunctive
So the
syllogism.
conditionals here would be the if.
If then,
If then,
right?
okay.
But so if I say, for example, the ball is either in the opaque box or it's in the opaque basket, right? I don't know which, right? And you show me that the basket is empty, then I deduce that it's in the box.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the disjunctive syllogism from the premise that the ball is either in the box or in the basket. It's not in the basket, therefore it's in the box. Right? That's another kind of example. Again, if you have in the language of thought a symbol in the language of thought for or and for not, it's rather easy to see how people find it rather kind of plausible, And then it's okay. So these would be reasoning would be easy, fairly natural to implement in the language of thought according to the hypothesis of the computational representation theory that Fodor proposed. But that means that basically logic is part of the way we think, right? That something like logic
is in the mind.
Is in the mind, exactly. And then the question is, for example, then lots of questions arise, including the question of development. Is it innate in the mind of children? Or how do children learn this? How do they learn it? Do they learn it through learning language or learning natural language?
Right.
Yeah.
So to sum up, could we say, so we have Turing machines, basic computers.
Right, exactly.
On the one hand.
Yes.
And then on the other hand, we have minds that seem to be able to represent the world. And we need an explanation.
Yes.
And so the computational representational theory of mind solution is to say, well, look, we have this kind of language that we can define using logical operators and then symbols.
Exactly.
This is implementable in a computer, and therefore we have an explanation of how this happens.
Yes.
This seems to explain reasoning.
That's right.
And therefore we have a theory of psychology.
We have a theory of psychology. That is, we provide a way of solving the kind of challenge, how is psychology possible? But of course, we put a lot of stuff in the mind. So this, we think that the operations and the operators in the mind have very rich expressive power, right? And some people think it's too much. On the other hand, the idea that the mind is a kind of a computer might seem disgusting to some people. Or might seem questionable, and has been called into question on many, many different, not always consistent grounds. But for example, we know that emotions, right, or consciousness, or conscious experiences, are very important to our mental lives. It seems to be true both from an introspective point of view and also from a scientific point of view, that emotions play an important role in social relations or in decision making, for example. How can that be, reflected or mirrored in the computer model of the mind? That's a big question. And a further question is, it seems like our body, I mean, our non-neural bodily environment of our brain matters a lot. You know, because, for example, we use fingers to count. I mean, but the computer doesn't seem, I mean, of course, you can think of a robot and add to the computer robotic, and that's been, in fact, done in robotics and in AI. But so many questions and many objections have been addressed to Fodor's version of the computational representational theory of the mind along the lines, what of emotions, what of conscious life, because you can be a computing machine, have no consciousness in a certain sort of having I mean, you could be a zombie, right? And compute, right? The importance, the apparent significance of the body to resolving many cognitive tasks doesn't seem to be reflected in the computer model of the mind.
So I'd like to pick up on one of those strains because I think it'll seem quite apparent to our listeners maybe that when we think about how the mind works, and maybe if we hear the expression cognitive science, many people think about the brain. Oh, it's studying the brain, right? But when you define computers, like a computer can be implemented in all kinds of different hardware. And so in putting forward this theory of the mind, one can wonder, haven't we obscured something, which is the contribution of the brain? And doesn't the way the brain actually works, shouldn't that kind of play more of a fundamental role in how we define what we're doing here?
That's right. That certainly is a legitimate question, but some people, I mean, so you're right. I think this is a very significant question. I mean, both what is the role of the brain with its physics and chemistry, its particular physics and chemistry. And we seem to have actually basically abstracted away from the physics and the chemistry of the brain, as opposed to very abstract computing devices which can be implemented in many, many different ways, not reflecting the particular physical structure and chemical structure of the brain. But for some, it was seen as a virtue to abstract away from the particular physics and chemistry of the brain. For example, functionalism, which was a view to which Fodor subscribed, but other philosophers too, seem to provide a more general. So the question is, are we looking for very special explanations due to the particular physics and chemistry of the brain, as opposed to much more general explanation that could apply much more generally to mechanisms and devices made of a different physics and chemistry than the brain, right? So one particular interesting example by the philosopher Hilary Putnam in the 1960s, which was an argument in support of non-reductive materialism, non-reductionist physicalism, something that's consistent with physicalism but doesn't want to reduce the explanation to the levels of physics and chemistry, was a paper which I think it was called The Nature of Mental States in the late 1960s, where he asked the question, look, we want to be able to ascribe, for example, pain to many, many different organisms, very different from humans, including, fish and mollusks. And we don't want to exclude organisms which seem to be very, very different. So if we can ascribe something like pain to organisms with such different physics and chemistry, it would be a mistake to try to identify what it is to be in pain to the brain structure of humans when they are in pain. We should actually liberalize the physical and chemical basis of the support of the pain ascriptions, and it would be a mistake to restrict ourselves to brain. So functionalism was a view that favored this kind of abstractness of explanations for cognitive science away from the chemistry and the physics of the brain. But of course, by looking at the brains of organisms who process information, we gain enormous knowledge. I mean, the fact is that by doing neuroscience of vision or by doing neuroscience of emotion and so on, we acquired ways of, so, for example, I mentioned in my own interest, earlier interest, the dual model of human vision, which was something which was generated by the discovery of a bifurcation in the anatomical pathway of vision. Giving importance to the physical and chemical and biological structure of the organs that enable humans to process information. So I think that, I think that the functionalism went probably too far in the direction of abstracting away from the physical and the chemical structure. But we want to keep in mind that maybe, Martians have a very different chemistry than humans, and maybe that does not prevent them from processing information. I mean, that's a question which I think is still unresolved. I mean, still ongoing and still open to a lot of interesting discussion in philosophy and science, in cognitive science.
But so, you mentioned functionalism, which is a kind of abstract, idealized philosophical theory of how scientific explanations should go.
Yes.
On the one hand, and so this allows us to say that psychology, being a more abstract discipline, is probably the central one of cognitive science.
Yes.
But then when we look at where the money goes, we can see that the people who get the most funding are probably neuroscientists.
Yes,
I mean, I haven't, but just being around people and labs, this is what I see. I haven't read any, numbers, but it does seem that neuroscience has been a really important motor of scientific discovery in the cognitive neuroscience.
Yes.
And so there seems to be this gap here between what philosophers say explanations should be and what explanations we've actually been giving.
Yes.
And so this prompts the question, what role, concretely, do you think philosophy of cognitive science has played in the development of cognitive science? Do these prescriptive ideas that are produced in philosophy of cognitive science sometimes, do they play any real role?
I think this is a very important question. So on the one hand, if you address this kind of question, what kind of breakthroughs have the brain sciences brought to understanding of how the mind works and how mental processes work? And when we think about the money, the funding that has gone to neuroscience as opposed to, let's say, the psychology of reasoning, this is something very important. And so the fact that the neurosciences are part of the natural science, I mean, there's no doubt that, if you are a neuroscientist, a cognitive neuroscientist, you are a biologist. You are doing life sciences, even if it bears on the cognitive sciences. But if you do psychology or linguistics, you're not. I mean, Chomsky thinks of linguistics as part of what he calls biolinguistics. So I think it's indirectly part of biology, because if you study the language faculty, even at a very abstract way, without looking at neurons, but just looking at intuitions about language or about your native language and so on, you are a biologist, theoretical biologist. So
everyone's a physicist.
By this, exactly. Everyone is a physicist, including common sense. I mean, so I recommend reading a very interesting piece on behalf of the philosophers' reluctance to think that the brain sciences should be leading cognitive science. Fodor has written extensively on this. He has gone to extreme formulation, Fodor, in the 1990s, saying, well, who cares about where in the brain something is taking place? That's not interesting. That's just irrelevant. Where it happens, I Fodor, don't care, and nobody should care. Okay, so I think that's not a very convincing response to the brain sciences, because it's true that much of the knowledge of the brain sciences has been about where in the brain an operation takes place, which brain area is particularly involved in processing relevant information. But there is a much more moderate response which was provided by a very important philosopher of mine and philosopher in general, Tyler Burge. In the New York Times, I forgot, about 5 or 6 years ago, he wrote a very eloquent, he is the author of a number of important books, including a book which I admire very much, which is called The Origin of Objectivity. It's a book published in 2010. But so in the New York Times, he wrote a very interesting piece in which he said, look, don't give too much importance to the study of the brain if you're interested in the mind. I mean, it's important, but not so important, right? And it's a plea for the centrality of psychology. Still, of modeling, of the role, of the leading role that modeling in psychology plays to understand mental processes and the architecture of the mind, which is not directly revealed by looking at brain areas and how active. But on the other hand, what has brought everybody's attention to the brain and to the brain sciences is, of course, brain imaging, because when you have these gorgeous pictures of brain activity involved in cognitive processing, it's irresistible to think that these, these disciplines that enable you to have images of brain activity should be, supported, among other competing ways of doing cognition. So I can perfectly understand the attraction of giving importance to the brain sciences, but I also am rather struck by the fact that so far much of the research in of the brain sciences and neuroscience in general has provided information about which brain area is active when one reads words or when one solves a arithmetical problem or when one does visual perception or when one is in pain. And that's important. That's a significant kind of finding to know which part of the brain is active. But that's not the whole story. We want also there are other questions which have not been resolved yet by looking into brain areas when a participant is doing a cognitive task.
But maybe just to be the devil's advocate here, wouldn't the neuroscientists retort to that by saying that, functional mapping has been an endeavor since early incipience of neurobiology?
Yes.
But they seem to be cognizant of these issues and have sort of developed methods to get at causality.
Yes.
They're not just interested in
where
the activity is going.
Yes.
So wouldn't your previous response be sort of an over-exaggeration of what's going on in the neurosciences?
Well, let me mention, I think one of the scientists who has brought most to articulating cognitive science and enabling cognitive science to go forward, even though his positions are debatable, is Chomsky. And one thing that Chomsky has been saying over the years, which is an interesting view, is that, so he's trying to develop fairly abstract models of syntactic processing, of how a grammar of a natural language is organized, together with trying to tackle the problem of language acquisition and provide, making progress in the question, how do children acquire the grammar of the native language? And before Chomsky's work, this question could not be asked. The way he addressed the nature of language, the language faculty, had this tremendous impact on our understanding of what the language faculty is, but also it made impact on developmental psychology for other fields, But so he seems to be saying that you cannot directly map what's been learned in linguistics and what's known in the neurosciences. There's no direct way of bringing together, theories, whether minimalist or other theories in generative grammar, without knowledge of how neurons work. But one thing he's saying is that, by analogy with the history of physics and chemistry, in order to unify physics and chemistry, physics had to undergo a revolution. Because, it couldn't provide explanation for chemical phenomena unless physics itself underwent its own revolution. And his position is that currently our inability to map fruitfully, usefully, knowledge from linguistics and knowledge from the neuroscience is because the neurosciences are not sufficiently advanced to provide a reduction base or not a unification together with linguistics. I'm not saying he's right, but at least
he would know as an expert biologist.
Excellent. I can.
No, Chomsky's.
I agree. One should be cautious. One should be cautious when one seeks Chomsky's position. But you're right. That's. Certainly, But also, he emphasized it's not all in the brain because there's the guts, and there are neurons down there which play a tremendous role, and we don't really know enough about how the nervous system in the guts works to explain linguistics. I'm sorry. No, we shouldn't make fun of this because these are important questions. So we should ask Nancy. I mean, what did Nancy say about this? Nancy Canvisher.
She didn't say much about language.
No.
I mean, she didn't say much about language, but that is precisely why I asked you this question. I think she very much admitted to the fact that, hey, look, when I'm talking about domain specificity and domain generality, I don't really care about where it is happening in the brain. It's just a way of sort of getting at the more broader philosophical question.
Sure. But domain specificity is so central to her way of defining her enterprise. And what she thinks she learns about the mind from the neuroscience is the domain specificity or modularity, which is a notion that Fodor and Chomsky have really introduced, but their own views of modularity are very different. And Chomsky's and Fodor's were agreed about much, but they didn't have the same view of what a modular system, how to define a modular system. But anyway, right. So, but did she mention the importance of the guts?
No. We haven't had any guest talk about the importance of the guts.
No, Chomsky does. Chomsky to challenge the neuroscientist says, but you're thinking about you're only talking about the brain. But now if you bring the guts in the picture too, it becomes much more complicated. Until you can unify what's going on in the brain, what's going on in the guts, you won't be able to unify linguistics with the
speaking about the gut and speaking about criticisms, since we have been talking about the computational representational theory of the mind, some people also think about the body as a thing that the traditional cognitive sciences and plural have missed.
Yes.
So could you sort of briefly summarize some criticism of different elements of the cognitive revolution and sort of give us an idea of the landscape of other approaches that have emerged in response to omissions of the body or other experiences?
Right. I can try. And I think there are kind of trivial things to say about this. And when we move away from the trivial things and we try to make them non-trivial, they become much more contentious and controversial. But trivially speaking, things like breathing, having a digestive system, and so on, which is not part of the mind as defined by the computational representational theory of the mind or by, cognitive science narrowly viewed in this computational, computer-based model. These are, if you think of them as enabling conditions for cognition, but not part of cognition. So I think we should make that kind of basic distinction. We should be, if somebody challenges the computational representational theory of the mind as a basic approach for studying the mind and mental processes by saying, what about breathing, and what about the digestive system and the cardiovascular system? And if in response, an advocate of the computational representational theory of the mind says, yes, you're right, these are fundamental enabling conditions, but they are not themselves cognitive mechanisms. They are enabling mechanism. They are mechanism necessary for cognition, but they're not cognitive. Now there are, for example, one fairly famous scientist, unfortunately died prematurely. His name is Francesco Varela. I don't know, he's a well-known, he published this hugely influential book, Varela, Thompson, and Roche, called The Inactive Mind, and maybe he
I
coined...
think it's the embodied mind.
Oh, The Embodied Mind, yes. No, absolutely. The title is The Embodied Mind, and so it's one of the first manifesto for embodied cognition, also inactive cognition, because there are a number of theorists, philosophers, more than scientists maybe, who talk about embodied cognition, embedded cognition, inactivism, and extended mind. I mean, these are the basic kind of, there is this famous 4E cognition slogan. And 4E stands for embodied, embedded, inactive, and extended, right? Now, each of them, so I could go through these each separately, and it's worth doing. I mean, so the promotion of the extended mind thesis is something done by philosophers, not by cognitive scientists. Famously, Chalmers and what's his name?
Clark.
Not Bloch. No.
Clark,
yes. I'm sorry. Yes. Chalmers and Clark and Chalmers, exactly. Published this 1998 paper, extremely influential, called The Extended Mind. Okay, and basically their argument was that many cognitive artifacts are very important, very useful for performing cognitive tasks, and they are not located anywhere in the cranial box within.
So, what are some examples of cognitive artifacts?
What are a computer might be, or a ruler,
Notebook.
Notebook. A book. Absolutely. All of these, are not within the skin of the agent who is carrying on the task, let alone part of his brain, right, or her brain, right? It's really outside, and it plays a role. So, again, the question is: it's a significant challenge. It's a very interesting one. The question is, whether we want to use to call it mental or cognitive, or whether we want to think of it as a tool. I mean, the guy who actually invented the extended thesis, really, first version, is Dan Dennett, who is another very influential and very smart philosopher. And he said what's really crucial to human intelligence, as opposed to the intelligence of non-human animals and species, is their ability to download onto the environment much of the task to simplify the operations are. And he was talking about notebooks, and he was thinking of old patients like me in hospitals where you need to you don't remember things, so you use little stickers of papers to remind yourself of tasks or things to do that you have forgotten, and so on.
So you're downloading stuff
way
before the internet.
Exactly, you're downloading. Yeah, and but writing, for example. I mean, just the invention of writing.
Very high fidelity rate. You don't need a wire
absolutely
connection.
And read. So learning to read and to write. I mean, that's of course a very. But again, the question is whether, so it's hard to know whether we're talking about intuitions we have, or whether it makes sense from a scientific point of view, whether we better think of writing and reading as tools or as part of mental processes, part of the mind. If I lose, that's a question that, anybody would say. So if your pen or your notebook is part of your mind, and you lose your notebook or you lose your pen, are you losing a part of your mind? I'm not, this is a question.
So that's what the Pixie song is about.
Yes.
They lost their notebook.
No, but that's right. But these are questions which are raised by these interesting challenges to the computational representational theory, which says that it's all in the brain. So neurocentrism is the view, that the mind is the brain, and nothing else is the mind. So it's a materialist version, identification between mind and brain. And so challenges are, what about the body, which is not the brain? I mean, it's the environment of the brain. And what about the notebook or the, but I think, it's not as if we knew, we don't have a satisfactory resolution of all the questions raised by adding, either the body. I mean, you lose so you cut my finger, okay, because it's,
I hope not, but
no, but
but
do I lose a part of my mind? I mean, I don't know.
But
you are amputated, and these are questions, serious questions. I mean, you undergo surgery. I underwent surgery. I mean, so for example, I had an operation on the heart. Did my mind change? I mean, maybe it did. I'm afraid it did, actually, but
but it is a good analogy with the objection to these approaches. So the enabling conditions.
Yes.
Would a good analogy be, okay, we have ornithology, right? The study of birds. And then we observe, okay, but would birds be around without trees? Birds and trees seem to come together. Wherever there are trees, there seem to be birds, and where there are birds, there seem to be trees. Do we have to therefore say that trees are birds?
Yeah, that I think, but I think, if you think that for many natural scientific reasons you don't want to confuse, you don't want to have a single category, trees that fly or birds that with roots. No. Because in fact, you could say that from an evolutionary point of view, the emergence of trees antedated the arrival of. I guess. I mean, I don't. I wasn't there.
You're not Chomsky. You're not a biologist.
And
an evolutionary biologist on top of that.
That's right, exactly. But if we have grounds for thinking that there were trees without birds, and birds then, and then trees provided a niche, an ecology for birds. I mean, trees provided an ecology for. We have many reasons to, not confuse. Even though, as you say, it makes sense to think that for many purposes, trees are enabling conditions for living birds, right? Or
to link the 4E cognition stuff up to a question that we asked you earlier, which was, what role has philosophy played in the development of cognitive science?
Yeah.
Do you think, computationalism has been an important motor for scientific progress in cognitive science. And 4E cognition rejects computationalism in some form, depending on which E you prefer.
Yes, exactly. Not all of them, but yes.
Yeah. Do you think, and so some people say that that one of these approaches will constitute a kind of paradigm shift, some kind of new revolution in cognitive science, similar to the cognitive revolution. Do you think that this will be the case in the near future, that we'll see some kind of important new revolution? And do you think such a revolution is needed?
Well, I think that, what's important in science is often that you can't predict what's going to happen. What I'm myself tempted at the moment to say is that none of the 4E cognition's criticisms of the traditional paradigm are likely to generate interesting, novel. I mean, look, let's take embodied cognition as one of the mainstream paradigm. I mean, there's I think something quite ambiguous in the embodied cognition paradigm which needs to be really clarified. The question is it really the possession of a bodily anatomy or bodily architecture that is important for the study of cognition, or is it the capacity to represent your body and not just things outside your body, which is important for cognition? We have the ability to represent, for example, our fingers, our hands, our knees, and our feet. Is that capacity to represent parts of our body when we perform cognitive tasks, that's significant and should be studied, investigated? Or is it the fact that we have feet, we are symmetrical. We have, a certain kind of orientation up and down and so on. So is it the possession of the bodily structure, or is it the capacity to represent bodily parts when we are engaged in
But isn't that a bit tautological?
Because look, take amputees, right, who have lost their body, but they're representing their body. So we could be brains in a vat representing our body, our non-existing bodies, and that might help us solve cognitive tasks, even though we don't have a body.
But then the amputees did have a body in the first place.
They had a body in the first place, absolutely.
Which could then lead to the idea that you had the body before, and then that leads to the representation.
But these questions are not, I don't think we have a clear view about what primarily matters. Is it, do people who think that, want to recommend embodied cognition, do they want to recommend the importance of the possession of the body, or the capacity to think about the body and think about the work of Frédéric de Vignemont, who wrote this nice book.
Who was our guest on the 3rd episode of
okay. And so she must have talked about this.
We talked about this a bit, about representing the body.
And having a body and actually making use of our bodily resources versus... Because, you can think of the body as the bodily environment of the brain, and a particular, which is a kind of an intermediate shell between the brain and the non-bodily environment of the bodily environment. And I'm not sure what,
This is like the chicken and egg problem, basically.
But then the question of the possession of the body versus representing the body.
But then I guess here, I think there's a common theme that keeps emerging in all of our discussions so far, which is this chicken and egg problem, which makes me think whether it's even productive to sort of think in these dichotomous terms, whether it's the body first or the representations. And I think you summarized the whole debate pretty well, irrespective of the particular opinions that each of us might have about embodied cognition or computationalism in terms of enabling factors versus core cognitive processes.
Exactly.
So is that a useful distinction to have if we were to make a more productive contribution to the study of the mind?
I think so. I think that one of my view is that people who talk about the extended mind, people who talk about the embodied mind or embodied cognition, the first challenge which they have not really addressed enough in detail is whether what they think, tools, artifacts, which they think are constitutive parts of cognition, or the body, which is constitutive part, whether it's really a constitutive part or an enabling condition. And this is an interesting, a really deep and interesting question.
And do you think this is an empirical question?
Well, I think it's partly...
No, because you could sort of say that it's either a philosophical question or an empirical question.
Well, there are ways of trying to design maybe experiments. When we think about amputees
and on the contrary, people who still have their members but can't represent them.
That's right.
Yeah, you could have a double association.
That's right. Exactly. And I think, there is, people who were interested in the role of mirror neurons have done some interesting work about aplasic people who have paralyzed or have no feet and so on. I think it's a very, it's as I see it, what I would say that what advocates of embodied cognition and extended mind have drawn our attention to is this very question. We should think about trying to draw a distinction between what's an enabling condition and what's really a constitutive part of a cognitive system. And that's not something that's obvious. I would say that the discovery that there are, neurons in the guts is an important empirical discovery. But so what? So what is the significance of this discovery for the role of the brain and for cognition? We don't know. Is
it a psychological discovery, a biological discovery, or a linguistic discovery? Who knows? One last...
Ostromsky. But that's right. No. But look, all these questions... I don't have an answer to these questions, but I think these, these should be thought philosophers are particularly good at, I think, trying to disentangle some of these questions, but they're partly conceptual, partly, they may have an empirical dimension.
Mm.
But
so before wrapping up,
yes,
I guess we can touch on one last topic, which is one that is particularly of interest to you, which is the role that developmental psychology has played. So you've been working on this for the past 10 years or so, and it seems like understanding where in someone's life cognitive capacities come from really illuminates the study of said cognitive capacities. So do you think this is the case?
I think developmental psychology as a whole, right? I mean, this trying to understand infants' cognition, steps of development, what's due to ontogeny, what might be actually due to phylogeny, right? I mean, are very fundamental to cognitive science. I mean, I think the contribution of developmental psychology to our understanding of the brain and the mind, cognitive process, is really great. I mean, my interest in developmental psychology came from the fact that there were discoveries showing that we were completely wrong about what an infant cognition, the state of cognition is. I mean, the preparedness of infant cognition, whether for language. I mean, of course, I mean, there's this Chomsky picture that, there are constraints on acquisition without which learning a language would not work. But for example, Stan Dehaen's wife, Ghislaine Lambert Dehaene, has made discoveries about very, very early responses to linguistic structures. There are data about infants' preference for the voice of the mothers, for the speech of the community, and so on, which are totally unsuspected. I mean, had you asked psychologists, linguists like 50 years ago, I had no idea. In my own domain of interest, which is mental state attribution, I mean, in social cognition, this is really fragile and vulnerable. I tend to take, there is this puzzle which I mentioned earlier about the fact that if you use verbal tasks, you don't get the same results in false belief attribution as when you use nonverbal measures and so on. My own inclination to make sense of the whole situation is to take findings based on nonverbal tests at face value in spite of the so-called replication crisis of some of the basic findings, because I think this is a genuine scientific question. When is a result reproducible, not reproducible? What small differences may have, huge impact on the replication and so on. But I think I want to I think my own inclination is to take findings based on nonverbal tests at face value as evidence for false belief attribution, for mentalizing in infancy. And one question is, if you think that infants learn all these things, they must learn it from their interaction with knowledgeable adults. And I think so far as I'm aware, all of the models of acquisition or learning from interacting linguistically or otherwise with knowledgeable adults fail lamentably to provide, to shed light on the process of acquisition. So I think it makes sense to think that humans were selected by through natural selection for being able to read minds, and that what some scientists call the altriciality, the motor ineptness of infants, makes them particularly prepared to read the minds of their caretakers, and to elicit the interest of their caretakers to survive, because of all the species we know, humans are the ones that will certainly not be able to survive if caretakers do not. There's a wonderful book by this anthropologist called Hrdy, Hrdy, called Mothers and Others. I don't know whether it's a wonderful book, but anyway, so my temptation is to think that developmental psychologists on things like mental state attribution should shift pass the bucket to biologists again, like Chomsky proposed to do, and say and try to explain mental state attribution in infancy by evolution by natural selection, that infants have this capacity because it helped them. It was selected by evolution. Now, of course, this is my own reading of the literature, which is a philosopher, which shouldn't be trusted. But many psychologists want an ontogenetic developmental story, going from inability to better ability and so on. But I don't think. I mean, one. I'll close up and shut up after this example. Two famous scientists, Celia Hayes, you know her? I mean,
Cecilia Hayes,
yeah. Exactly. And Chris Frith, a very well-known cognitive scientist, have proposed that children learn mental state attribution, mind reading in English, the way they learn to read words or print. I think this is crazy, because if kids were not able to attribute mental states to their teachers, they would never learn to read words. I mean, okay, that's too simple, of course, but that's... I think even the idea that, you should take mind reading, the expression mind, seriously, so that the analogy between reading minds and reading words, and learning to read words could be a model for learning to read minds. That this, to me, these are very eminent scientists, and they're crazy. Don't. No.
You hear this, Celia Hayes and Chris Frith? You've been called out, and Chomsky as well. Chomsky, okay, going down.
No, I never said that. I did criticize them in print, but I shouldn't. I should have. I'm not a diplomat. I'm sorry.
Speaking of Chomsky, again, though.
I'm a great admirer.
A famed biologist, Noam Chomsky.
Physicist, you mean?
Yeah, sorry, everyone's a physicist, I forgot.
No, I'm sorry. Let's not make fun of me. Yeah.
Something that just popped to my mind is that it seems like when you think about the development of cognitive science and then developmental things, the poverty of stimulus argument seems to be a really important instance of development playing a really central role. Yes. So can you explain how this might be?
Well, yes. I say so. My way of understanding. Well, Chomsky's he made famous the argument by the poverty of the stimulus in language acquisition. I mean, if you take his latest position, which I think does not convince most practitioner linguists, which is his minimalist position, I think one way to capture the essence of the argument by the poverty of the stimulus is that what infants or adults are exposed to is the linear structure of sentences. How words follow each other, one another in a sequence, right? But rules of grammar, the relevant principles of syntax are not linear. They have to be formulated over a hierarchical structure, and then which is very different from linear order of words. So the hierarchical structure, which is relevant to syntax, is not anything that can be detected or perceived by infants or adults. And that's the main argument for the poverty of the stimulus, that the relevant structure has to do with the hierarchy of syntax, but what is in the sample of utterances, which is directly detectable either from an auditory point of view or visual point of view, and so on, is the linear structure. So, for example, take the sentence like, the cat drank the milk. Okay? What's crucial is the fact that the cat is a noun phrase and drinks the milk is a verb phrase. And the verb phrase, contains the noun phrase, the milk, which follows. But what you perceive is just the succession of words. The cat drank the milk. And you don't perceive directly the fact that the noun phrase, the cat, is a relevant syntactic unit, nor is the fact that the next relevant syntactic unit is the verb phrase, he drinks the milk, because you don't see the boundary, you don't have evidence for the boundary, right? And so that's what I mean by difference between the linear order and the hierarchical order, that's something like this. And I think that's a very strong argument for the fact that there is underdetermination of the grammar by the evidence, namely, or the poverty of the stimulus. And now I think something of that kind is the case also in mental state attribution, namely that, so the way I think of the main experiment, how experiments are pursued, you want to understand how something in the mind of an agent is going to help you predict or explain. That say predict is easier than explain. Predict what the agent is going to do. So, in a standard false belief, study of false belief, you have an agent who places her relevant toy in the box, right? And then either departs or her attention is taken away. And while she's not attending, she's not seeing, the toy is being taken from the box to the basket, or vice versa, right? Now, so the child or the participant, the very young participant, knows now where the object is, but the task is to make sense of the likely behavior of the agent, and the child has reason to believe that the agent is motivated to find the toy, right? So will the child assume that the agent will look for the toy where it is, where the child knows it is, namely in the basket in my story, or in the empty box where the agent falsely believes it to be. Now, if there is reason to believe that a young child expects an agent to reach for the empty box, while the participant, the child, knows where the object is, but you find behavioral evidence, for example, looking time, more surprised to see the agent go to the object where it is than at the empty location, or such things, or saccadic eye movement makes a saccade towards the empty location, or other things like this, or brain signals. Then, that's poverty. Then you think of the poverty of the stimulus from linguistics and say, but is it that the child is used to seeing people look for objects where they are not, as opposed to where they are? Does the child have a rule, for predicting an agent's behavior, where the relevant behavior is seeking an object that one wants to find? Okay, so I think the poverty of the stimulus that Chomsky made so popular for learning language does apply indirectly to the study of mental state attribution, because, we know that other species, for example, chimps and so on, have a little, there is some evidence that they do anticipate the likely action of a mistaken conspecific. We think that there's no such evidence for monkeys, which are, whose last common ancestor with us is much more ancient than apes, etc. So there is an asymmetry, for example, between the evidence for the fact that non-human primates can attribute the difference between knowledge and ignorance, which is rather strong, and the evidence for attributing a false belief. And if you reflect on this difference between attributing ignorance, right? So if I think that you don't know in which of two locations the object is, I predict that there is 50% chance that you will go, look for it on the right or on the left. But if I attribute to you a false belief, right, then I can predict that with very high probability you will look for it at one location, not the other, because that's where you falsely believe it to be. And that's very important for social interaction, for competition, for cooperation, and so on. It seems to be something that we humans have, not so evident that it's shared by, other primates, although the difference between, attributing ignorance, not knowing, in birds and also in apes and primates. So anyway, so the question, I think, is there a kind of a teaching going on that that we adults who attribute mental states, including false belief, we don't teach that to children. You don't teach a child look, I don't think because it's too complicated. I mean, look, at the relevant age when, you couldn't teach a child how to attribute a false belief because the language you have to use to teach the attribution of false belief is far more too complicated to the syntax and semantics of the language for teaching mental state attribution, including false belief attribution, seems to me computationally, unlikely to be understood by the 2-year-old child or 3-year-old child. Try to teach a child. I mean, imagine the task of teaching a child to attribute a false belief to an agent who performs an instrumental action. He wants to satisfy his desire in light of his beliefs. His beliefs can be true, his beliefs can be false. In that case,
And hell, even like an adult might have trouble following that.
Absolutely. But we do it so spontaneously. We track other people's, and we correct people. No, you're wrong. If you want to find your chocolate, it's here, not there. But teaching this or explaining what we do to an adult would be fairly complicated. I mean, we can do it as scholars. I mean, in writing books or in writing papers.
Yeah, no, it's like you said. Oh, yeah, language uses hierarchical transformation.
Yeah, exactly.
Not linear ones. And I said, hold up, nobody understands this.
That's right. But
yet we do this all the time.
We do this all the time.
We have these.
So we form in order to form a question, a WH movement. Which drink did you have last night? And we understand that it's the object of drink. Did you have? I'm sorry, yeah. And it was moved from the right of have. I had scotch. Which drink did you have last night? You move the object of the verb drink to the extreme left in English, say, right? How do you know that that's the way to form a question? I mean. Again, you don't teach this. You don't teach children, and then when you explain this to an adult, it's fairly. It takes a linguist to explain this. It's the same for mental state attribution. I think there are very relevant differences between the capacity to attribute mental state and the capacity to use to speak a language and to learn mental state attribution, to learn a native language are very interesting. But there are some features I think common to which can be captured by what Chomsky called, whether physicist or biologist, the poverty of the stimulus.
One last question we usually ask to our guests is if there's anything you would like to clarify in what was said, or if you think any really important thing was missing.
So many things.
Of course.
So many that I can't think of. No, the main problem, I think, is that as a philosopher can't know there are many areas of important development in science, which escape me and probably...
philosophers are supposed to know nothing. So.
That's right.
According to the Socratic adage.
No, but for example, I don't think very hard about AI. I mean, ChatGPT is to me a complete mystery, how it works. I wonder whether the people who are the best, who create ChatGPT really have an insight into how it works. I had a conversation once with ChatGPT where I asked, what's wrong with Chomsky's minimalist approach to language? And he gave me a perfectly sensible, he could actually give me a Chomskyan criticism of ChatGPT, of the scientific significance of ChatGPT. ChatGPT can give you a very good Chomskyan critique of the importance of ChatGPT. So how does it
Sounds
work?
like an existential crisis to me.
Yes. No, but I'm, yeah. So I don't know. It seems to be very interesting work. People like Josh Tenenbaum at MIT, who combines developmental psychology, AI,
so that's kind of
that's my
kind of what's next
for
cognitive science.
Yeah, I think so. It's for example, there was this paper again to go back to Chomsky with such a force. There was this piece, maybe you have read it, in the New York Times, right? On where he discuss the limits from his point of view, of the limits of the scientific interest of ChatGPT, which is an interesting technological.
Yeah, doesn't he call it just like a plagiarism machine?
Yeah. But he thinks that it doesn't tell us anything significant about how the mind works, how we learn language, how we use language, we humans. And I think it's questionable. I mean, he's quite radical in his negative assessment of the scientific virtues of this. But on the other hand, he seems to have a point that at least when he says, it works on enormous data bank with, and that's not how infants, do when they learn a language and so on. But I don't know. I'm not. Yeah.
So, you've been listening to Cognitions, the 9th episode. We've been chatting with Pierre Jacob about the history and foundations of cognitive science. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you, Pierre.
On the next episode of Cognitions, we'll chat with Therese Collins about the psychology of human vision. If you are curious about how we are able to see the world, be sure to tune in to the next episode.